the Sounds True Podcast Network.
Not only is the universe not cold and lifeless or meaningless, but it's moral, that there is a moral order to the universe that holds us all. All human beings, as far as I know, long for belonging, they long for respect, they long for pleasure, they long for meaning. And these are the yearnings of the soul, and they are woven into our nature because they are present in the universe.
Welcome, friends. In this episode of Insights at the Edge, I'm so pleased to say that David Brooks is our guest. David Brooks is a well-known Canadian-born American author and commentator. He's been writing an op-ed column for the New York Times since 2003 and is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and appears regularly on the PBS NewsHour. He's the author of several best-selling books, including The Road to Character, The Second Mountain, and most recently, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Seen. Friends, stay with us. David, welcome.
Pleasure to be with you.
I'm sitting down with How to Know a Person, and I will share honestly that I had never sat down with one of your books before. And the first thing that happened for me is I was just stunned by how enjoyable it was to read How to Know a Person. So that was the first observation I had. Then the second observation, which is where I want to start our conversation, is I felt this sense of, I'll just use my own language, heart vision pervading the book. And I was like, what's going on with David Brooks? I don't know this gentleman that well. What's happening? And then I learned more about what you might call some mystical illumination or numinous experiences you had, and how in 2013, and once again, I'm using my own language here, this lit up for you a vision of people being souls and looking at all kinds of people as these soul beings. And I want to know more, not just about the experience you had, that's interesting to me, but how that changed your vision.
Yeah, I would say there's been a drastic change. My wife and I have been married for 9 years, and she sometimes sees videos of me from like 20 years ago. And she says, well, I wouldn't have married that guy. And so I think I'm a pretty different person than I was. And I would say there were two processes that were interconnected. The first would be an emotional awakening. Like a lot of guys, I would say I had emotions, but there was no highway between my emotions and my mouth. So I did not know how to express them. I did not know how to even feel them to some degree. I remember thinking back when I was like, before my kids were born, it's nice to be shallow, because all these deep people are suffering all the time, but I'm not suffering, so it's kind of nice to be shallow. And that way of being is symptomized by an event that happened to me maybe in 2008. I'm at a baseball game, with my youngest son, and I've been to 1,000 games. I'm a big baseball fan, and I had never caught a foul ball. And we're sitting there in Baltimore, and a bat flies out of the batter's hand and lands in my lap. So I've caught a bat. And if you know baseball, catching a bat is 1,000 times better than catching a ball. And so any normal human being would have waved this trophy in the air and been on the high-fiving everybody around him, been on the Jumbotron, just showing joy. I just took the bat and put it on the floor and stared ahead like a turtle. I had no emotional reaction at all. And I want to go back to that guy and say, show a little joy. And so I really wanted to learn to process emotion better, just as a way of becoming a better person. And I think I have. I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and the speaker asked us, all of us in the audience, he gave us a piece of paper with lyrics to a love song. And he says, find somebody you don't know, gaze into their eyes, and sing the love song to them. And if you had asked me to do that 15 years ago, I would have combusted. But I found some guy, I sang the love song, and I did it. And I was sort of proud of myself. It's a sign of sort of an emotional vulnerability that wasn't there before. And along with that came a spiritual awakening. And I think the two are really very intertwined. And the incident you referred to in 2013, I was in a subway in New York. And if anybody knows New York, they know the second ugliest place in New York is Penn Station, where the Amtrak trains arrive, the old station. And the ugliest part is the subway station next to Penn Station. And so I'm sitting there in a subway car, and I look around and I have this sensation that all the people around me have souls, that there's some piece of them that has no size, weight, color, or shape, but gives them infinite value and dignity. And more than that, the souls were yearning, that the souls were in motion. And some souls were sick and in degradation, some souls were soaring, some souls were quietly suffering, some souls were quiet, some souls are ill. And so it was a sense that made my profession make sense. That if I'm going to write stories about people and devote my life to journalism, the people, it should not be writing about just a bunch of molecules. It should be writing about people whose lives have infinite value and dignity. And so it is that yearning of the soul, and really the transformation in my life, I think, from a very cerebral existence for the first many decades to hopefully a more romantic and spiritual existence in the last decade and a bit.
I'd like to dig in a little bit deeper, if that's okay, to both of these transformations, the way you're describing them. In terms of this yearning souls, what did you actually see? Because as I hear you describe it, I am envisioning, I'm seeing a movie inside my own head that's like kind of like ghost-like light beams coming out of people. And I'm like, is that what he saw, or am I just making that up?
Yeah, I think it might be the way I saw it. I think it was like, I guess, I don't recall any visual shimmering.
Okay.
But I recall an awareness. Another experience I had, and after I had that experience, I had a series of experiences in rapid succession. One was I was hiking in Colorado, and I was atop a mountain top, and there was a lake up there. And the lake was held by mountains all around. And I happened to bring a book of Puritan prayer called High and Holy, Meek and Lowly. And somehow I had a sensation there of the moral order of the universe clicking into place, like the way a car door clicks in a really nice car, like a Mercedes or something. You close the door and there's a click. And that sensation to me was the idea that we are all held in a moral order. That I think the first sensation of souls was that the material explanations for the universe are inadequate to experience as I experienced it. That was the subway car. But in the mountaintop, it was the sense that we're all held within a moral order. That not only is the universe not cold and lifeless or meaningless, but it's moral. That there is a moral order to the universe that holds us all. And that rape and slavery are not just wrong, and sometimes in some places, they are wrong eternally. And that this moral order is woven into our natures. That all human beings, as far as I know, long for belonging, they long for respect, they long for pleasure, they long for meaning. And these are the yearnings of the soul. And they're woven into our nature because they are present in the universe. And I'm a religious person, or became a religious person through this process. So I would say they were ordained by God.
Now, it's interesting to use this phrase, I became a religious person. I would say at Sounds True primarily, and here the Sounds True podcast, we're always talking to people who say, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And I noticed you have a slight like, wait a second, I don't identify that way. I identify in this different way as a religious person. And I thought, this might be an interesting sort of area to explore together. Tell me why it's important for you to call yourself a religious person, not a spiritual, but not religious person.
First, I would say, if just a little more of my favorite subject myself, for many years I was religious but not spiritual, which is to say I grew up in a Jewish home, married a Jewish family, raised my kids in a Jewish home, kept kosher, went to synagogue, did all the things. But I never encountered faith there. I encountered a strong sense of peoplehood there. And then when I became aware of the numinous, of the transcendent, it fit in well with the Bible as I understood it, the moral order, the sense of human drama, And the Beatitudes, the Gospels of St. Matthew, are to me the place where the splendor of divinity pokes through and really appears. That's a radical document, and a document of almost inspiring and otherworldly love. And I think I prefer to be religious, A, because I believe that God exists. B, I believe that he expressed himself through texts and through the stories, and that we come to know him by arguing about texts. And whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, or if you're Muslim, Quran, or anything else. But finally, I find religion necessary because, at least in my experience, and other people have very different spiritual lives and more advanced than mine, spirituality doesn't ask something of me I don't want to do. Spirituality, in my experience, is too easy to be fuzzy, to come forward with obligations. It's too easy. It does not contain that moral order that, there was a historian, George Marsden, who said what gave Martin Luther King's rhetoric such force was his belief that natural law, the moral order, are built into the fabric of the universe, that segregation is always and eternally wrong, that slavery is always and eternally wrong. And that structure, which is embedded in texts and in religious traditions, is something that helps give my spiritual life structure and shape and direction, and demands a submission that I think, at least for me, again, just a vague spirituality doesn't demand.
In How to Know a Person, you talk a lot about how to see from another person's perspective, how to get behind their eyes. And so that's what I'm doing in this conversation. Now, if you and I were sitting together here at my house in the living room, and we had the luxury of having a 12-hour conversation, I might share with you a bit more about the moral obligations that I feel come from my spiritual but not religious grounding. But we'll save that, David, for another time. Now, talking about this moral universe and a moral life, you write in How to Know a Person, morality is mostly about how you pay attention to others. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I need to understand more about that.
Yeah, this is not my thought. This is Simone Weil's thought, the French mystic from World War II era. And she said, attention is the ultimate form of generosity. And her student was the great novelist and philosopher, Iris Murdoch. And Iris Murdoch said that we normally pay attention to each other with self-serving eyes. How can this person serve me? Is this person making me feel good? Are they making me feel bad? And she said, but that should not be our goal. That's a selfish and immoral way to see. Our goal should be to cast a just and loving attention on others, to bring a gaze upon others which sees them in a just and loving way. So not just totally sentimentally, just, but not without love. And the example Murdoch gives is a woman who doesn't really like her daughter-in-law, and she finds her immature and too shallow. But the mother is aware that she has a tendency towards snobbery, and she's a little old-fashioned. So she decides her goal is to be and her behavior toward her daughter-in-law is perfect in all cases. But her goal is to see her daughter-in-law in a different way, with different and more generous eyes. So instead of immature, she's going to see her as fresh. Instead of shallow, she's going to see her as enjoyment-loving. And she's just going to change the attitude with which she sees that daughter-in-law. And I think that's what we're called to do. And I'll tell you a story. And I tell it in the book. I was in Waco, Texas, having breakfast with a woman named LaRue Dorsey. And when I had breakfast with her, she was like 93. And actually, I just learned she died 2 weeks ago. And she presented herself to me as a strict drill sergeant type of lady. She'd been a teacher. And she said, I loved my students enough to be tough with them. And I was a little intimidated by this very formidable lady. And into the bar walks, or into the diner, you can see my lifestyle, into the diner walks a guy named Jimmy Durrell, who's a pastor in Waco. He serves the homeless. The homeless were uncomfortable coming to his church, so he brought his church to the homeless, and he holds services under a highway overpass. And he sees us both. He comes up to us. He grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders and shakes her way harder than you should ever shake a 93-year-old and says, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best. You're the best. I love you. I love you. And in an instant, she turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. He brought forth a different version of her with the quality of his gaze, the quality of his attention. And so I think that's what Iris Murdoch meant by casting a just and loving attention. And to get back to Simone Weil, she said, prayer is pure attention. And when I read that, I was reminded of an anecdote I once read. Dan Rather was interviewing Mother Teresa. And Dan Rather asks her, when you pray to God, what do you ask him? And she says, oh, I don't ask him anything. When I pray, I just listen. And Dan Rather said, well, what is God saying to you? And Mother Teresa says, well, God isn't saying anything to me. He's just listening. And if you don't understand what I'm talking about, I can't explain that to you. And so it's that act of attention, of attending, which shows respect, which shows compassion, which is the gateway to all other human connection.
You have this phrase that you use, the illuminator's gaze, as a way to describe this quality of attention. Where did you come up with that phrase?
Don't know. It just popped into my head. When you're writing, one of the things that you find are truly powerful are dichotomies. And I once had a dichotomy in the book, The Road to Character, between the eulogy virtues and the resume virtues. And people repeat that back to me every week. And they also repeat this dichotomy I make in this book. I only allow myself one dichotomy every 3 books. And it's the diminishers are people who are uncurious about you. They don't ask you questions. They stereotype. They do a thing called stacking, which is they learn one fact about you, and then they make a whole series of assumptions about who you must be. And I've learned in a career in journalism that nobody lives up to their stereotypes. And then the other people are illuminators. They are curious about you. They make you feel lit up. They show you respect. They show you curiosity. And you really thought, you walk away from them thinking, that person was a really good listener. Some examples, there was a great novelist named Eames Foster who lived about 120 years ago in England. And his biographer wrote of him, to talk to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity, you had to be your sharpest, most honest, best self. And so it's that quality of his listening that makes him an illuminator. There's a story told about Bell Labs, and some of the researchers were just a lot more productive than the others. And they want to know why. Was it they had better training? Nope. Did they have higher IQs? Nope. The researchers who were more productive were in the habit of going to the cafeteria and having breakfast and lunch with a specific an electrical engineer, a guy. And he would get inside their problems, ask them about what they were working on, give them suggestions for how to think. He got inside their minds. And so he's an illuminator in a very practical field. And so I've come to think, sometimes I leave a party and I think, that whole time nobody asked me a question. And I've come to think only about 30% of humanity are question askers. They're perfectly fine people. They're just not that curious about you. They're presenting themselves. And so illuminators are a great kind of person to be.
Do you ever notice yourself falling into the diminisher's gaze and think, hey, wait a second, what am I doing here?
Yeah, I go into a party, let's say I'm going to a dinner party at a friend's house. I'm going to really pull people out. I'm going to really listen today. And then I have a glass of wine and I think, I've got this funny story to tell. And then I've got another funny story to tell. And I find that I haven't done what I had hoped to do. I've just been on broadcast mode. And that's sometimes, you don't want to be only receiving and not giving in a conversation. But I have a tendency to be on broadcast mode too much. Maybe it's a question of my job trains me to do that.
Sure. And I'm going to continue and keep you on broadcast mode here. So when you mentioned, when I asked you about this numinous breakthroughs, heart vision, you talked about an emotional awakening. And that I found extraordinarily interesting. I don't hear people use that language much. And I think that's what I felt pulsing through How to Know a Person. It was asking me, once again in my own language, to see the world through my heart. And you tell this tremendous story of a French writer during a tsunami in Sri Lanka that to me really was the takeaway, break open my heart story of the book. And I wonder if you can share that. I'm asking you, please go on broadcast mode, David.
Yeah. Let's see if I can remember it. I wrote the book a couple of years ago. It was a guy named Carone. I've now forgotten his first name, but he's vacationing in Sri Lanka, and he's in a bad mood with his girlfriend. And they were not married, but they're boyfriend and girlfriend. They each have a son, and it's their first day of their vacation, and they're fighting. And he realizes that he's going to have to break up with her, and he realizes the core problem is that he's incapable of love. He just doesn't know how to love. He's never loved anybody. His relationships all failed because he's incapable of love. And they're in such a bad mood, they decide to not go do the scuba diving thing they signed up for the next morning. And that turns out to be a consequential decision because that was the morning the tsunami hit. And if you remember, it was decades ago, but the tsunami swept across the Pacific and killed thousands and thousands of people. And when the tsunami hit, there was a little girl from another French family also staying in the hotel, playing in the waves. Her grandfather was watching her. And her grandfather was reading the paper while she was playing in the waves. And he feels a wall of water sweeping him up. And he has his thought is, I'm going to die. And his second thought is, my granddaughter already has. And he gets swept inland by the wave, and then the wave starts receding, and he's pushed into a palm tree, and a fence pinions him to the palm tree. And so the water is receding, and he's stuck on the palm tree, and he lives. He comes down, and he realizes he's now going to have to go into town, which has been untouched by the wave, and tell his son and daughter-in-law that their daughter is dead. And he says, I saw them across the square, and I realized that was their last moment of pure happiness. Carrère, the French guy, the author of the story, his wife leaps in action. She's the kind of person in a crisis who is helping everybody. Carrère feels useless. But over the next 4 days, they sit with the family, the parents of the dead daughter, and they have one meal after another. Getting emotional telling the story. And there's one moment in one meal where the mom is not eating. She's lost her daughter. She's not eating. She tries to eat, but her hand just shakes as she tries to bring rice to her mouth. And her husband is watching her. He's trying to keep her together. He's trying to, in effect, say, stay with us. Don't go somewhere else. Don't go into crazy land. And so he's trying to keep the tone light. He's telling jokes. He's pouring drinks. He's watching her like a hawk. He's trying to stay with her. And Carrère looks over at this guy over dinners, and he says, there it is. That's real love for your wife. There's a man capable of real love. And they're being sent home. And finally, they can go home. And I think he's in bed with his partner, the woman he was going to break up with. And Carrère has this thought, if there's one thing I must do in this life, it is to spend my life with her. That is the one thing. And she felt the same way, and they ended up getting married. So the power of that story is the power of a man being emotionally broken open. And for most of us, and I would include myself, it's a process that takes years. But in that case, because of the tsunami and the extreme circumstances, it took a few days. And you see a heart broken open. And, you know, when I've been through hard times in my life, and I've cherished a phrase from the novelist Friedrich Buechner, that you can either be broken open by hardness or broken. And when you're broken, you make yourself invulnerable. You protect yourself from hardship. But when you're broken open, you make yourself more vulnerable, even in the place of hardship. And it's a gutsy thing to do, but it's necessary if you're going to turn a hardship into a growing experience. There was a theologian, Henry Nouwen, who said, you have to stay in the pain to see what it has to teach you. And that seems like bad advice, like stay in the pain, why? But in those moments of suffering, I do think we see each other more deeply than we do in normal happy moments. Just one final quotation is from a guy named Paul Tillich from the 1950s. He said, moments of pain interrupt your life and remind you you're not the person you thought you were. They carve through the floor of the basement of your soul, reveal a cavity below, and then they carve through that next floor and they reveal a cavity below. So we see deeper in ourselves in the moments of hardship than we do in moments of happiness. And when you see that deeply in yourself, you realize only spiritual and relational food will fill those cavities. I think the career story in Sri Lanka is a story of somebody really who had a hard shell and in extreme circumstances found a real capacity to love.
Turning a hardship into a growing experience. I wonder, David, if you could talk directly to that person who's right now listening and finds themselves in a hardship and is not quite sure how to find the genuine growth in it. It feels a little forced, something like that.
Yeah, well, I'll tell a story that I told in the book, what I learned about having that kind of conversation. My oldest friend in the world is a guy named Peter Marks. And Pete had suffered from depression only at age 54 or so. As far as I know, he did not suffer it before. But when it came hard for him. And I made the mistake that I think I've now learned are common when talking to people going through a hard time or suffering from depression. The first mistake I made was I tried to tell him how to make the depression lift. I would say, he was an eye surgeon. And I would say, you should go on a mission trip where you give free surgery so people in Vietnam can see. You find that so rewarding when you do that. And I realized later that if you're trying to give a depressed person ideas on how to make depression lift, all you're showing is you just don't get it. Because it's not ideas they're lacking. They know the ideas. They're lacking desire, energy, a lot of other things. Second, I made the mistake of trying to remind him of how wonderful parts of his life were. The kid loved his career, great marriage, his boys are amazing. And I was only reminding him that he was not enjoying the things that are palpably enjoyable. So that was a mistake. And I think I gradually learned first that for those of us who've been fortunate enough never to experience depression, we can understand it by extrapolating from our own moments of sadness. Another friend of mine named Michael Gerson, who suffered from it, said that depression is a malfunction in the instrument you use to perceive reality. And so in the case of my friend Peter, he had these obsessive voices in his head telling him, you're worthless, no one would miss you if you're gone. And I think what I should have done, and the way we should have talked about this, is first acknowledge the reality of the situation. This sucks. Tell me how it sucks. I think a lot of people feel isolated in their pain. They can't quite express what it feels to them. And often when you run into somebody who's going through hardship, there are like two of them. There's the person experiencing the pain, and then another version of themselves is watching the person experience the pain and trying to figure it all out. And so just like accept reality. The second thing I've been told by a pastor to say is, I want more for you. I want more for you. And those words won't do anything. In fact, there are not many words that will do anything, but just an affirmation of my expression of goodwill toward you. Third, constant touches. I should have sent him a text every day because I think he was worried that his friends would leave him because he wasn't much fun to be around. But a text every day says, I'm not going anywhere. And I read about a guy who his brother was going through a hardship and he was traveling and he sent him a postcard every day. Just a postcard every day. I'm thinking of you. Then I'm reminded of the words Viktor Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist in the prison Nazi concentration camps. And when people would come to him with suicidal thoughts, he would say, life has not stopped expecting things of you. And that sounds harsh to my ears, but I trust Viktor Frankl knows what he's talking about. And then, the final thing I'd say is that, and I think about this personally, and I think about this for our country, frankly, that people move forward through a process of rupture and repair. Then I ask people, what made you who you are? Nobody ever said, well, I went to vacation in Hawaii. It was fantastic. That made me the person I am today. It's always some moment of hardship, a moment in the valley, and rupture and repair. And the thing I learned about being in the valley is that it's really hard to get yourself out of the valley, that somebody has to reach down and help you out. And I'll tell a story from my own life. I went through a hard time in this period of 12 or 15 years ago, and I was getting divorced, and my kids were leaving home to go off to college, or preparing to. And I was living in a crappy little apartment and doing what any male idiot would do, was trying to solve spiritual and emotional problems through workaholism, just work. And I was accepting dinners. Any invitations I got, I was accepting because I was really lonely. And I got invited over to a house by a couple named Kathy and David. And Kathy and David had a son in the DC public schools who had a friend named James, whose mom had some issues, health and otherwise. And she couldn't always feed her son, James. And she couldn't always house him. And so they said, well, James can stay over when he needs to and eat with us. And James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And by the time I went over there, one Thursday night in 2014 or 2015, there were 40 kids around the dinner table, and there were mattresses all over the house for kids sleeping. And I walk in the door, and first time there, and there's a young man. We call them kids, but they were like 17. And I reach out to shake his hand, and he says, we really don't shake hands here. We hug here. And I'm not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but I started hugging. And I went to that house for dinner every Thursday night for the next 7 years. And we did that. We did holidays together. We did Christmas. We did vacations together. And it was a chosen family with about 8 adults, I guess, and then 40 what we would call really teenagers, late teenagers. And it was a chosen family. And what that whole community did was they demanded emotional openness. They beamed love at you, and you really were inspired and had to, and almost impelled to beam it back. And so that community, which lasted until COVID, and still we obviously stay in touch, really was the healing. That was the repair. And so it is that process of rupture and repair that we go through, I think, periodically in our lives. And there's really no escape from them. And some people, as I say, become stagnant, and some people endure it and grow.
In terms of your own growth to this type of emotional availability, what were the actions or commitments that you made as part of that process?
I guess, one, it was just a commitment to not be the person I used to be. Like, I was the kind of person nobody would confide in. I was a person who always had a clock in his head. This is something I still struggle with. Like, when I go to the gas station, I think, I've got 90 seconds pumping gas. I get 2 emails done. That productivity clock is that's a killer of relationships. Because if you're sitting with someone and you're thinking, I've got to go off to the next meeting or whatever, you're not really present. And so it was just like looking at myself and being dissatisfied with myself. And so what did I do? I wrote a book about emotion called The Social Animal. And it was like, I'm going to write myself into being a better person. And that, I don't know if it's better, but writing is my process of self-expansion, of expanding the circle. So I wrote a book about emotion. I think I just become, you're working out your stuff in public when you're a writer. And my other favorite thing about writing is writers are beggars who tell other beggars where they found bread. And so if I find something in a book that's helpful to me, it gives me great pleasure to put it in one of my books and share it, pass it along. So I think the act of writing, and then frankly, after the divorce, the act of dating was an emotional education for sure. And then falling in love again and getting married. And those are all acts of expansion of the heart. And I think what it made me realize, a belief and a conviction that was latent within me. I'd been raised by academics, and I'm a pretty heady person. But I do believe the heart is more important than the brain. And that our sentiments are really the most trustworthy thing about us. Back in the 17th century, there were these vicious wars of religion, and Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in great number. And in the 18th century, people said, stop. We've got to stop this. And so there were 2 branches of the Enlightenment. The one branch, which was French, said reason or emotion and religious fervor are murderous. They're killing people. So we have to create a cult of reason. and that our reasoning brain is really the dignity of human being. And they literally had a cult of reason in the French Revolution. But there was another enlightenment which centered in Scotland. And they said, we really don't think reason is that powerful. Reason is weak. One of the Scottish philosophers, David Hume, said, reason is and ought to be the slave to the passions. And he meant by that your emotions are sensitive. Your emotions are wise most of the time, if they're well educated. And so you can learn to trust your emotions. And I do believe the heart is really the driver of our lives. Reason, the heart tells us where to go, what we want, and how passionately we'll go, how fast we'll go. The emotions, and reason is just there to help plot the course. So it is slave to the emotions. And so the process of educating your emotions through literature, through art, through ritual, through painting, that is the key educational act of life, not the stuff that goes on in a schoolroom with a teacher lecturing to students. And it's that emotional education, that's the one we conduct in our adulthood and really through our adulthood, if we're going to grow and become deeper people as we go along.
One of the things I want to talk to you about is this notion of how we tell our story. You mentioned writing yourself into a better life, and that this is how you processed these in the valley moments in your own life. And in How to Know a Person, the book is divided into 3 sections. I see you in your struggles, which we've talked a little bit about, and then a section on I see you in your strengths, which I want to talk more about. And in that section, there's a chapter on life stories. And you write, the ability to craft an accurate and coherent life story is yet another vital skill we don't teach people in school. But coming up with a personal story is centrally important to leading a meaningful life. You can't know who you are unless you know how to tell your story. You can't have a stable identity unless you take the inchoate events of your life and give your life meaning by turning the events into a coherent story. So I want to ask you about this because over the last few years, I've gone through a really difficult passage, and I'm not going to go into the details, but to say that there are a lot of different elements in it and a lot of different vantage points from which I could tell the story. I could tell it as a story of failure or a story of victory, depending the mood I'm in. I could tell it as an inner secret story of this or that. And there's so many different ways. And I would say it's inchoate at this point. It's chaotic inside me. And lots of people I haven't seen in a while, they'll say something like, Tami, tell me the story. What's been going on? And I think, okay, I'm going to have to tell 12 different stories. And so I'm curious to know more about this process of how you weave it into something coherent.
Yeah, well, I find very few of us, maybe some writers, but not even me, maybe novelists, like sit down and think, okay, I'm going to tell the story of my life. We only tell the story of a life and learn to tell the story of a life when we're put in circumstances where somebody asks us. And of course, different circumstances are going to arouse different versions of a story. If I'm at a meeting with a bunch of lawyers and we're discussing some contract and somebody asks me, who are you? You're going to get a very different version than if I'm on a podcast dealing with spiritual and deeper things. Or if I'm with, somebody I knew in college and was close with back then, but haven't seen in decades. So I think people bring out different versions of a story. But I think if you think of the basic plots, I do think a lot of our lives fit into a basic plot. And in the book, I mentioned some of them. I just told you a little bit of my story. And it's a classic redemption story. I was going along fine. I suffered a crisis. I came back better. That's a redemption story. And there's a guy named Dan McAdams who studies this at Northwestern, who once wrote a book called The Redemptive Self, saying humans tell redemption stories about themselves. And he book toured around the world, and a lot of the audiences in other countries said, what are you talking about? Americans tell redemption stories, but we don't tell redemption stories. And so there are other kinds of stories. There's overcoming the monster. I was attacked by alcoholism or some other, illness or some challenge, and I overcame the monster. I was born into blessing. and I lived up to my responsibility to share the blessing. And so there are lots of different stories you can tell of your life, but I do think there are some elemental plots that you fit into. And I guess I am trying to think, like, I would say I have different versions of the story I tell in different circumstances, but I think my story is one story. You might be more complicated than I am. And just because I need to know what to do next. And I think it was Doris Lessing said, how we know what to do next unless we know what story we're a part of. And we tell stories, then we live into the stories we tell. And I just read a great book by Andre Agassi, the tennis star. And he had a monster of a dad. And he said, I hate tennis. And he spent his adult life, playing tennis and being great at tennis. And his essential story was, I'm enslaved to a game I hate, and I'm addicted to it, and I can't get out. And I read another memoir by Tina Turner. And as we all know, she grew up in Nutbush, Tennessee, I think, had a beautiful voice, married a truly awful human being, Ike Turner. He really enslaved her. He paid her no money, didn't give her any power. He cheated on her with every woman he encountered. He forced her to live with several of his mistresses and beat her brutally. And it took her 14 years to build herself into the kind of person who could stand up to Ike Turner. And she did it by meditation. She did it by studying Eastern philosophy. She did it just by understanding her own mind and creating her own voice. And after 14 years, Ike was beating her one day in the back of a limousine, and she started fighting back, something she had never done before. And that night, they were at some hotel, and she escaped out the window. She ran across the highway. She nearly got killed. She went to a Ramada Inn and asked the manager, could you please put me up? I've got no money. And he did. And she called her friends, and she made her way and started at age 40 a career trying to be a successful, sexy rock star at age 40. And she did it. Over the next 30 years, she built her solo career. She remarried and had a beautiful second marriage. And so her story is one of submission, of slavery, really, of development, self-growth, and then of prosperity. And it's a 3-act story. And I think she understood her life through that. And she wrote 2 very good memoirs, which is how I know the story. And so I find it useful to have one overarching story that I present differently. I guess that's how I put it.
I think part of what has me engaged and curious about this is the notion that how we tell our story is a creative act that we can take on. Just like our perception is a creative act. We can choose an illuminator's gaze. We can tell an illuminator's story. I'm wondering what you think about that, David.
Well, I think all perception is creation. It's a creative act. We think we open our eyes and light beams flood in, and then we see like the way a camera sees. That's not how we see. What we do is we project models of what we think we're going to see out into the world, and it's prediction correction. And so, for example, and the models we project are based on what's in our head. So we're speaking English here. So if you and I saw a rainbow, we would see a 7-colored rainbow. But of course, there are no bands in a rainbow because it's just a continuum of light. There's no such thing as color. It's just rays of light. It's just rays. We're creating the color. And so if somebody speaks Russian, in Russian, they have 2 words for blue, light blue and dark blue. And so they don't see 7-banded rainbows. They see 8-banded rainbows because they have different models in their head. And there's a famous experiment I bet a lot of our listeners have seen called the basketball experiment, where they make people watch a video, and there's a group of people passing a basketball. And after the video, they say, "Did you see the gorilla?" And the people on the subject of the experiment say, "What gorilla? I didn't see any gorilla." They say, "Watch again." So they watch the video again, and there's a group of people passing a basketball around, and a guy in a gorilla suit walks into the middle of the basketball game, waves his arms, and then walks off. And the people did not see the gorilla, most of them, because they didn't predict gorilla. And so every act is an act of creation. There's a neuroscientist named Anil Seth who says life is a controlled hallucination. We're constructing the world in our head based on the very limited information our senses give us. And so if you take that on, then the very act of telling our story is just like the same thing that Charles Dickens is doing, the same thing Jane Austen is doing. And even the act of seeing a scene is the same thing Vincent van Gogh's doing. It's just they write it down. And so we each have our own way of seeing. And frankly, when we encounter a Van Gogh painting, he gives us another way of seeing. We see the Starry Night on fire. And we see in that Starry Night painting, there's a church there in the middle of the painting, which is empty, and the light has gone out in the church, and that's Van Gogh's commentary on the church. And so we don't only see paintings, we see according to paintings. If you've seen Picasso's Guernica, you don't see war again the same way. He's taught you to see it in a different way. So I'm just trying to emphasize the creative element. All the things we think are objective and simple, like perception, are really very complicated. And it's based on what we have inside of us. One final quick story, which is a favorite of mine. There was researchers at the University of Virginia asked students, there are a lot of hills on the campus of the University of Virginia, and they had researchers ask the students, how steep is that hill? What's the grade? And people overestimated. The hill was a 5-degree grade, and they estimated it was like 30 degree. But one day, the researchers asked a group of students, and they got it exactly right. And they were wondering, why is the data correct this day when it was wrong every other day we've done this experiment? It turned out that day, they had asked members of the women's soccer team. So they'd asked Division I athletes how steep the hill was. And these were very fit human beings. And so to them, the hill didn't look very steep. And so the point is, the way we see a situation depends on what we're capable of doing in the situation. And if you're fit, you see a very not steep hill. If you're very heavy, you see a very steep hill. If you've got a backpack on, you see a steeper hill than if you don't have a backpack on. If you listen to sad music, you see a steeper hill than if you listen to happy music. It's all inside us. And so that's what this thing called constructivism is. And we have to respect the creative ways we're putting together the world, either in very helpful ways or very unhelpful ways.
In terms of seeing other people deeply, you offer in How to Know a Person a lot of just practical tips. And there's one that really stuck with me, so I want to make sure to mention it. It was the most powerful tip for me in my life, which was treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer switch. Treat it as an all-or-nothing affair. Because I think most of the time when not here during this conversation with you. You know, I've been interviewing people since 2009, and I've interviewed my wife a couple of times about her work. And she said, wow, you never pay attention to me in the same way as when you interview me, Tami. And I thought, God, I should do this more often because it's a full on-off switch. And often in the course of our life, you know, I'm listening to her, but I'm also, you know, unloading the dishwasher or doing all these other things. And she'll say, could you please just stop and give me your full attention? Very simple act. And I'm like, I can hear you while I'm undoing this thing. You know, anyway, so I thought that was a terrific pointer that would really, in many ways, change a lot of things. Just that one thing, full on-off switch.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't thought about this, but sometimes it's nice to have a distraction. It's nice to be driving. Somehow the conversation can flow. But when you really get into something serious, and I think your default should be when you meet everybody is 100% not, or 0%, not 60-40. And we've all met, and there are some politicians who that's their magic. I would say that was Bill Clinton's magic. And everyone says he treated me like I was the only one in the room. That was a standard cliche about Bill Clinton, and I think it was sincere. It is sincere in Clinton. But yeah, those are just practical skills. I mean, some of the others, when you're in a deep conversation, one of them that I was given was be a loud listener. That I have a friend who, when you talk to him, it's like talking to a Pentecostal church. He's like, yes, preach. I agree with that. Amen. I just love talking to that guy because he's so enthusiastic. in the way he listens. Another tip I got was don't be a topper. If you say to me, I had a terrible flight, I was on the tarmac for 2 hours, I'm inclined to say to you, yeah, I had a terrible flight, I was on the tarmac for 6 hours. And it sounds like I'm trying to relate to you, but what I'm really trying to do is let's pay less attention to your inferior set of experiences and more to my superior set. And so don't be a topper. I think it's been helpful to me to learn that there are just some practical tips that can really change the quality of your conversations, like the dimmer switch, and these things, these acts that we do with each other, they're like carpentry, they're like playing tennis, they're skills, and they can be taught. And like I mentioned earlier, how do you sit with someone who's depressed? That's a skill that can be taught, and we can learn that. How do you break up with someone without crushing their heart? Again, a skill that can be taught. How do you ask for and offer forgiveness? And one of the things that weirdly doesn't happen in our culture is the teaching of these social skills. I don't know if they were ever taught, but I get the impression more so before cell phones than now.
How do you break up with a friend without hurting their heart or breaking their heart? How do you say, this just isn't really working out, so I don't, that's obviously not how you say it. I don't know how to do this. How do you do this, David?
Yeah. Now I feel weird giving advice because I was always the one getting broken up with. I was never the dumper. I was the dumpy. But I would say one of the things that doesn't work is the sandwich. We're all instructed to, when we're giving feedback on anything, to give a positive thing and then a negative thing and then a positive thing. That's called the sandwich. And research has shown that does not work because all people hear is the negative thing. The positive thing they do not hear. I would say the one thing, there's a really good book I recommend called 10 to 25 that came out maybe a year ago. And it's about how to deal with people between ages of 10 and 25. And the author says, you think when you're talking to one of these young people that you're giving all sorts of wise advice or not, or telling them what to do or what not to do. But all they are hearing is, do you respect me? Do you respect me? Do you respect me? That is all they're hearing. And so the problem with the sandwich is it's a show of respect and then a show of disrespect and then a show of respect. All they hear is, oh, disrespect. There's disrespect in the air here. And there's another book called Crucial Conversations by a guy named Joseph Granny and a bunch of other people. And they say every conversation takes place on two levels. What we're nominally talking about, and then underneath it, the flow of emotions as we're talking. And that under conversation is the more important. And so and then they have a sentence which has really lingered in my mind, which is in any conversation, respect is like air. It's when it's present, nobody notices. When it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. And so when you break up with someone, sometimes the breakup happens, and the number one cause of divorce, according to the experts, is contempt. There's no respect left. And once you feel contempt for someone, it's really hard to stay married to them. And so in that case, it's hard to have a pleasant breakup conversation without being dishonest. But in most breakup conversations, the respect that drew you to the person is still there. The love may be gone, but the respect is still there. And so my instinct is that by showing lavish respect for who that person is, even though the love may be gone, is the right way to honestly explain why this isn't working out.
It's very helpful. Thank you, David. In terms of concluding our conversation, here's what I'd love to hear more about. You mentioned I'm a religious person, and that comes with certain obligations, commitments, responsibilities. What are they to you? What's the core of it to you?
Yeah, if you're Jewish, it's the ritual, and it's you can or cannot keep kosher depending on what kind of Jew you are. But I do think it's the ritual to have the Friday night meal, and I joke that every church service I go to is more spiritual than every synagogue Jewish service I go to. But every Friday night Jewish dinner, Shabbat dinner, is more spiritual than any church service. And I think it's the obligation to have the rituals. One is also obliged to pass down the story of one's faith. But then one is obliged to grow in holiness in a very defined way. So for Christians, the obligation and the submission is to attempt to become more Christ-like every single day of your life. And that can, for many people, involve spiritual disciplines like fasting, prayer journals. It often involves research and study. And for me, I'm a bookish person. So frankly, I get some spiritual uplift from music and architecture. But mostly it's reading spiritual books, reading books of theology, reading books about Matthew or about Deuteronomy or Exodus. Somehow that obligation is there, and it's my attempt to become more holy. And I do think with Thomas Aquinas that every little act we do changes a core piece of ourselves, either in the direction of sanctification or degradation. And one of the nice things about theology, it gives you a definition of the vertical, that you're moving upward toward sanctification or you're descending downward to degradation. And every little piece of media you consume, every TikTok video you consume, every conversation you have, the way you treat people, carves that little piece of you inside, which we call our soul, into something either a little more sanctified or degraded. And we're commanded to live up to the covenant by searching for sanctification.
I've been speaking with David Brooks, author of the book, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Seen. David, thank you so much for the conversation. I feel so fortunate to have this chance to meet you and have this conversation with you and learn from you. Thank you so much.
It's
Respect
been a pleasure.
Is here. Respect, friend.
Okay, thank you. Back at you. Thank you so much for the conversation.
And if you'd like to watch Insights at the Edge on video and participate in the after-show Q&A session with our guests, come join us on Sounds True 1, a new membership community featuring award-winning original shows, live classes, community learning, guided meditations, and more with the leading wisdom teachers of our time. Use promo code PODCAST to get your first month free. You can learn more at join.soundstrue.com. Sounds True, waking up the world. The Sounds True Podcast Network.